Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Whine Dine. I'm your host, Miguel. I'm here to tackle this ever so tricky, the touchy, and the thought-provoking. So today I'm diving into a topic that's deeply personal and, let's be honest, a bit polarizing. So I'm going to talk about identity politics in the LGBTQ community. Now, don't get me wrong, because identity politics have played a huge role in getting us where we are today. They've been instrumental in fighting for rights and visibility. But lately, I can't help but to feel that something has shifted, something has changed. So the sense of unity that wants to find the LGBTQ community seems to be giving way to division. A bit of gatekeeping, and dare I say it, cancel culture. So just to help me unpack this, I'm just going to bring in perspectives from Douglas Murray, Glenn Greenwald, and the Fiery Vice debate that you can find on YouTube. And the links, I'm going to put the links in the episode description. So they have touched on a lot of the same issues. So grab your drink of choice, your food of choice. Mine's a Portuguese wine. So let's get into it. Let's just start this podcast by mentioning that Douglas Murray, he isn't exactly a fan favorite in the LGBTQ plus community. Not that he cares anyway, but just stating fact. And it's not hard to see why. His criticism of identity politics often hits close to home for those who feel those politics are essential. But here's the thing. He is gay himself, and his critiques, I believe, come from a place of frustration with what he sees as a movement losing its way. He's not the only one. There's a lot of people, I believe there's a lot of people with the same mindset. He wrote a book called The Madness of Crowds. So Murray talks about how identity politics, while initially empowering, they have turned into a kind of hierarchy of grievances. He argues that this focus on victimhood can overshadow the progress that we've made, and more importantly, the individuality of the people involved. Now, I'll admit some of his takes are hard to swallow. Not going to deny that. He does have a habit of reducing complex issues to sound bites. I mean, these days, who doesn't? They can come across as dismissive and offensive for some. But when he says that we've gone far from fighting for equality to competing over who's the most oppressed, I'm considering, is he wrong? Is he really that wrong? It's no secret about how I feel about pride. I have discussed this many times, including a few times on this podcast. I believe it used to be about unity. It used to be about different people coming together to celebrate and push for change. But I think now it feels like there's a divide between those who want to preserve that spirit and those who see pride as a platform for advancing specific ideological agendas, in my opinion. I'm just curious to hear from you, listener. I'm curious to hear what you think. Do you think Douglas Murray is onto something, or is he simply oversimplifying a movement that's constantly evolving? Or is he oversimplifying a movement that's constantly evolving? Next up, let's talk about Glenn Greenwald. He is one of those rare figures who manages to be both part of the LGBTQ community and a vocal critic of its modern direction. His focus is often on free speech and the dangers of conformity, especially in progressive spaces. He has argued that identity politics in the LGBTQ community can sometimes feel more like a set of rules than a movement for liberation. For instance, he has pointed out that how quickly people within the community turn on each other over disagreements. And he's also faced backlash himself for some of his opinions. But what I find interesting is about his perspective is that he's not rejecting the community, I don't think. He's challenging for it to be better. So he's saying, let's focus on the principles that unite us, not the differences that divide us. He could be wrong. I could be totally wrong. I don't see anything wrong with that. Maybe his rhetoric is offending a lot of people too. But I want to hear from you. I want to hear what you think. One of his big points is that the LGBTQ movement started as a fight for individual freedom, the freedom to love who you love, live how you want, and be who you are. But he also argues that in some circles, that's been replaced by a kind of groupthink that stifles individuality. But is he right? Is he right to push back, or is he missing the bigger picture here? I also think that one of the good things he does is really well is highlight the tension between liberation and control. So if you have to think about it, like the LGBTQ movement began as a radical push against societal norms that tried to box people in. It was about breaking free from laws, from stigmas and expectations that dictated how we should live our lives. But he thinks that some factions of the modern movement have flipped the script. Instead of fighting against the rules, we're creating new ones. So these new rules, it's about what it means to be truly LGBTQ, who gets to belong, and what you're allowed to say without being ostracized. So it's like we've traded one form of control for another, and that's a hard pill to swallow for anyone who values individuality. Because it's an interesting concept, which is community versus individuality, and sometimes it's hard to merge the two, in my opinion. But take the concept of cancel culture, which I haven't shut up about it. His critique isn't just about people being called out. It's about the chilling effect that it has on open dialogue. So he said, and I'm just going to paraphrase it now, that if people are too scared to speak honestly, then the movement isn't really about freedom anymore. And it isn't about the whole point of what we've been fighting for. So to be free to express ourselves, even when we don't all agree. And what I find most striking is how personal this issue is for him. It's not just observing from the sidelines, he's lived it. So it's, as someone who's been openly gay for decades and has faced criticism from both inside and outside the community, he knows what it's like to be judged for not fitting into a neat little box. He has pushed back against the idea that all LGBTQ people should align with a specific political ideology. And he's right. We're not a monolith. But so he's argued that being gay doesn't mean you have to agree with every progressive policy or activist trend. And to me, that's quite refreshing. People are complex, and reducing someone to their sexual orientation or gender identity, I think expecting them to think a certain way, it feels kind of reductive. But of course, he got criticized a lot. Some say he's out of touch, that he's too focused on free speech and not enough of the realities, of the lived realities of the ones who are marginalized. And while I think those criticisms are worth considering, I also think that they miss the bigger picture here. I think he isn't saying that systemic issues don't exist. He's saying that the way we approach them matters. He has a quote that kind of stuck with me, so I'm just going to read it out. So, a movement that fights for liberation should never become a movement that silences dissent. So let's think about that. At the end of the day, I think he's asking us to take a step back and ask, what are we really fighting for? Is it equality, freedom, acceptance? And if that's the case, are we willing to make space for people who don't fit the mold, who don't say the right things, or challenge the status quo, even within our community? It's a tough conversation, not going to lie. It's tough talking about these issues. We have to be very delicate. We have to be very sensitive to hurting people's feelings about these topics. And I think that's Douglas and Glenn's point. We shouldn't walk in eggshells in order to confront these issues. I think that's their point. I still think it's worth having this conversation. I think he's asking questions we need to answer before we lose sight of why this fight started in the first place. But you know what? Let's just get back to Douglas, because honestly, He always gives plenty to chew on. I mean, here's the thing about him, about Douglas. He's one of those people who, love it or hate him, you can't ignore him. And when it comes to identity politics, especially in our world, the LGBTQ world, he doesn't hold back. So, as I said before, his book, The Madness of Crowds, where he mentions that identity politics started a way, is kind of similar to Glenn. So, yeah, identity politics started as a way to empower people, but it has morphed into something much messier. He's not shy about calling it a competition of grievances. That idea that everyone's racing to prove that they had it the worst. And yes, it's provocative, but let's be honest. Is it touching on something real or is it not? Yeah, for example, Pride, I think he also believes that it lost its meaning. And I do agree with him about this. But he says it feels more fragmented. It's not just a celebration anymore. It has become a platform for all sorts of causes, some of which have nothing to do with the LGBTQ issues. I do think it's a fair question. That is not entirely wrong either. So when Pride starts to feel like a soapbox for 100 different agendas, does it lose some of its original focus? Or is it just the natural evolution of progress? It's just what we need to be addressing at the moment. I think this is where Douglas gets himself into trouble. His critics say he's out of touch, that he's dismissing the complexity of those issues. And let's be fair, I mean, sometimes he does reduce things to sound bites. And that is annoying when anyone does it. But unfortunately, that's what generates clicks. But yeah, those sound bites, they just oversimplify the bigger picture. And when he says that we've shifted from fighting for equality to arguing over who's the most oppressed, what do you feel about that critique? And I know there's some backlash. Douglas has been called everything from self-loathing to a sellout, and a lot of what's come within the LGBTQ community. People have accused him of pandering to conservatives or undermining the movement. And look, a lot of that criticism seems fair, I'm not going to lie. His tone can be, let's just say, cutting. But here's what makes him almost impossible to dismiss. I think he generally seems frustrated because he feels that the movement is losing its way. He's not tearing it down. He's just saying, let's rethink some of this before it all spirals out of control. And then there's a debate about gender identity, which Douglas has waded into headfirst. He's criticized how some activists shut down discussions about biological sex, saying that if we can't even have the conversation, how can we expect to make progress? This is very divisive. It's hard to say that without sounding that I'm agreeing with him, but I'm just going to say whether you agree with him or not, you have to admit it's a discussion that many people are having in private because they're too nervous to say it out loud. And at the end of the day, Douglas isn't trying to be liked. Clearly, he is not. I think he's trying to force us to think, to ask tough questions about where the LGBTQ movement is going and whether we're staying true to what it was supposed to be about, equality and freedom. Again, if that's not the case, if he's just doing that not to pander to a certain political movement, that's on him, not on me. But what do you think? Do you think he's onto something, or do you think he's just being a grumpy contrarian? Okay, do you know what? Let's just dive into that Vice debate. I watched the Vice debate on YouTube, and I will add a link, as I said, to the episode description. There's so much to unpack here. So if you're not familiar, Vice gathered a group of people across the LGBTQIA+ at its office to discuss some of the most pressing issues in the community and what we're facing today. So the panel included activists, thinkers, and everyday people, or normal people, ordinary people, with wildly different views on what it means to be LGBTQIA+ in 2024. I think the idea was to bring conversations that are already bubbling up in the community into the open, so we could all witness them. It was unfiltered, and I like that. I love those lively, unfiltered wild debate at some point. So they've covered Pride. If Pride is still relevant, I've already shared my opinion about Pride. They've also shared what the term queer even means anymore. And of course, they talk about Trump. On one side, you had people saying, of course it is. Of course pride is important and necessary and essential. For them, yeah, pride is still essential, specifically in places where being LGBTQ plus is dangerous. They talked about how pride gives people a chance to be visible, to connect with others, and to fight for rights that aren't guaranteed. And I get it, and I absolutely agree with that. If you're from a small village, I don't know, or a country where you can't live openly, pride is a lifeline. So it's not just a celebration; it's survival. But that's where I stand. To me, that's what pride should matter. Pride should still exist. But that's not what happens all the time. But yeah, so there were panelists who argued that pride has lost its way. That's my opinion too. So they pointed out how commercialized it's become, with corporations slapping rainbows on products in June and then disappearing for the rest of the year. Some felt that pride has become so focused on big parades and flashy events that it leaves out people who don't really feel comfortable in those spaces. If you're not into the glitter and the party scene, where do you fit in? I mean, pride means different things to different people, and that's okay, and that's great. Maybe it's not just about whether pride is relevant, but how can it evolve to meet the needs of everyone in the community? I mean, if we're going to include everyone, then let's include everyone. But what do you think? Has pride lost its purpose, or is it just changing with the times? And then there was a debate over the term queer. For younger panelists, queer felt like an umbrella term that celebrates fluidity and rejects rigid labels. It's a way of saying, I don't need to fit into your boxes. But for some people, some of the older members, queer is still a slur, something that is being shouted at them in their worst moments. This really highlighted the generational divide within the community. For some, reclaiming queer is empowering. It's about taking back control of a word that was used to hurt them. I think what I found interesting was how deeply personal this conversation was. It wasn't just about the word itself. It's about the history, the identity, and how we navigate through a community that includes people with such vastly different experiences. We're not a monolith. I keep saying that, and I will say it over and over, because that's a mistake that a lot of people from the LGBTQ plus community, people from different races, we're not one monolith. And again, I'm going to go back to Trump. The election proved that. The election just showed us that minorities don't have to vote a certain way only because their community tells them so. We're individuals at the end of the day. But I think it's a tricky thing, though. How do we embrace the evolving meanings of words while respecting the pain they've caused in the past? They've also, the expanding acronym, so the LGBTQIA+, they've also discussed, is it too long? Does it represent anyone? Or everyone, sorry. And does anyone even know what it all stands for anymore? Some panelists felt the growing acronym is a sign of progress, and it reflects an effort to include identities that have been overlooked and marginalized. But others, they think that it's becoming, it's getting to a point where people feel alienated rather than included. And I think one of them said they needed like a sheet or something, because it's that much of a long word that it's just a lot to remember. I think the bigger question here, though, is whether the acronym is helping or hurting, and does trying to represent everyone make it harder to connect with anyone? Or is this just a part of the messy but necessary progress, a process of progress even? Because personally, I think it's a bit of both. And then, of course, the conversation turned into politics, which I love, Trump in particular. So did these policies help or harm the LGBTQ plus community? This is interesting. This is it really resonates with me because I love politics. I love US politics. And of course, I'm part of the, let's just say, gay community. This was probably the most heated part of the debate, as usual. The conservatives on the panel defended Trump's record, pointing just pointing to things like his economic policies and saying that that benefited everyone, including LGBTQ plus people, queer people, whatnot. But progressives, but the liberals pushed back. So they've asked the hard questions about the transgender military ban. So what stood out to me, though, was how divided the room was, not just politically, but in terms of what people prioritized. For some people, it was all about the economy and national security. For other people, social issues like transgender rights, they were non-negotiable for those people. But can you separate the politicians' policies from their personal values? Or should you? So what is the takeaway from this debate? I mean, they're uncomfortable and people don't always end up holding hands, and that's okay. The LGBTQIA plus community is incredibly diverse, and I think that's wonderful. And not just in terms of identity, but in terms of thoughts, values, and priorities. I completely get that, and I'm all for it. And yes, that can create tension, but it's also strength. And the challenge is figuring out how to make space for those differences without losing the sense of unity that brought us together in the first place. And at the end of the day, it's not about agreeing on everything. It's about listening, learning, and just trying to realize that we need to move forward together even when we don't see eye to eye. But what I don't want, what I don't agree with, and I know this is going to sound a bit silly, but I don't want people to cancel others. I know people do need to be held accountable, but I think there's a difference between making someone accountable and canceling someone. I think canceling someone is something that should rarely happen, if you ask me. But anyway, so what about you? Do you think this Vice debate raised questions that you've been grappling with, or did it resonate with you? Do you think it missed the mark? Just let me know if you can, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. And yeah, and that's a wrap on today's episode of Whine Dine. I appreciate you. You could have been anywhere in the world, and you chose to listen to my podcast. Thank you. Yeah, so I've tackled a lot in this one. Identity politics is not a light issue. I know it's very tough. It's very serious, very divisive, but we'll get there. I'm hopeful. Yeah, so I've tackled that one in the LGBTQ community. Talked about Douglas Murray and his sharp takes, Glenn Greenwald's critiques, and the lively, messy, brilliant chaos of the Vice debate, as usual. So yeah, honestly, this has been one of those episodes that leave me with more questions than answers. But I think that's the world we live in at the moment. But I kind of enjoy that. So I want to keep the debate going. I want these conversations to continue. I want ideas, I want thoughts, I want conversations to make me think and hopefully help you see things from a new perspective too. And here's the thing, none of this is easy. Talking about identity politics, free speech, or even the meaning of pride can be exhausting. I mean, it's not easy for me either, but very interesting though. But sometimes it feels like there's no winning. You say one thing and someone's upset. You say nothing, someone else is upset. But you know what? That's okay. Progress isn't about getting it right all the time. It's just about showing up, being able to listen, and having the courage to say, I don't have all the answers, but I'm here for the conversation, respectfully. And I think it's important to acknowledge how far we've come. The fact that these debates can even happen openly. I mean, the people can challenge each other and still move forward. It's just proof of the progress that has been made. Sure, there's a lot to do. There's a lot more to do. The world right now, I'm not going to pretend there's not conflicts all around us, in the West included. And there always will be conflicts. That doesn't mean we can't appreciate what we've already achieved as a society. But where do we go from here? Because honestly, I'm personally still working it out. But I do know this. The best conversations, the ones that really matter, they're the ones that stick with us long after they're over. And the ones that challenge you, frustrate you, and make you think, maybe I need to see this differently. Just think about that. I want to hear from you, though. I want to know what your take is on all this. Do you think identity politics are helping or hurting the LGBTQ movement? Is Douglas Murray offering much needed critique, or is he too heavy handed? And Glenn Greenwald, is he an essential disruptor, or is just too combative? I'm going to add my contact in the episode description. And I'd love to know where you stand, to be honest. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can share it with someone who loves a good debate, or even better, someone who loves disagreeing with you. It'll make for a great conversation. So, yeah, that's it. Until next time, take care of yourself, stay curious, and maybe don't take life or identity politics too seriously. After all, the best conversations usually start with a laugh, a glass of a drink, or both. So yeah, cheers to that. Until next time.